Hello, I'm Anawiltus, and today I'm going to talk about secession in the United States Constitution and what exactly in the US Constitution actually opposes the idea of secession. Because it's commonly said by some people that secession is not mentioned in the US Constitution, and while it is true that it is not mentioned or addressed in a direct sense, there are several elements that secession would naturally follow that would prevent states from unilaterally seceding while being in while acting in accordance with the U.S. Constitution. Because of course, the 10th Amendment, you have this idea that there are enumerated powers that the federal government has, and that in matters in which are not expressed in the Constitution, such rights are to be held by the states or the individuals within the states. So I will say today that the US Constitution actually does prevent the idea of unilateral secession in its legal structure. And while there's a court case that addressed this issue in a more roundabout way, which is Texas v. White, an older court case from shortly after the Civil War, which talked about the nature of debts pertaining to states and bonds involved in Texas before and after the Civil War, and then the legitimacy of Texas's secession in that. I'm going to be taking a more direct approach, looking at the actual wording of a constitution. And let me just be very clear, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a judge, okay? This is just my opinion. If you don't agree with my opinion, it's not the end of the world. We just have a disagreement and we can maybe talk about it. So feel free to do that in the comment section below. So anyway, the US Constitution, there's the preamble, but the preamble is filled with generalities. What we're actually going to be looking at is the text in the various articles. So, Section 1, Article 1, Section 1, that is, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. Okay, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but the introduction talks about the article as referring to the powers and the rights and the way in which Congress operates. But what we're actually going to look at is Section 8, which talks more about the enumerated powers that Congress has. So, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imports, and excises, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Okay, to borrow money, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Now, this in legal application, this has expanded to mean a wide number of things, but I'm going to be taking a more strict perspective here, just if anybody's wondering. To establish an uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. So the rule of naturalization means how someone comes to be a citizen of the United States. So the Congress decides the uniform rule of national citizenship, how someone gets to have an American citizenship. Now that's one issue, but that's not really going into the subject of secession very much. However, it is talking about the nature of which authority establishes the citizenship of Americans, and that is not the individual states, it's actually the US Congress. to coin money, regulate the value, to provide for the punishment and of counterfeiting the securities, to establish post offices, roads, to promote the progress of the science, tribunals, to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the laws of nations. This is a more broader authority that the United States has, which talks about how the United States deals with pirates and perhaps individuals operating criminally in international water. The U.S. Congress gives itself the right to define how it will treat any such individuals. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulations of land and naval forces, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. So one of the things that Congress has the authority to do is to call forth the militia, and this is important in the context of secession, to execute the laws of a union and suppress insurrections and repel invasions. Now, this means that anybody that is seceding needs to make sure that their secession is not considered an insurrection or to be in violation of the laws of a union. This means that if a secession can be characterized as an insurrection, then U.S. Congress has the full right to stop it. Which means that any state that is seceding needs to find a way to secede that does not allow the U.S. Congress to characterize the secession as an insurrection. And this is difficult if you're seceding unilaterally, because you obviously have to remove your representation in the Congress, because if you continue to be in the Congress, then you're a foreign state in the Congress, and that means you have no power in the Congress. But if you also remove yourself from Congress, you end up being in a situation where you don't have rights as a state in the United States, and therefore any objection that you make to the actions of the United States cannot be made as an objection from the position of a state unless you deny your own secession, in which case then you can object, but then your secession itself would be invalid due to your denial of your secession. Which means that ultimately, in order to secede and be 100% sure that the US government is not going to treat your secession like an insurrection, you need to gain the approval of the federal government and Congress first before you secede, because if you do not, then since you no longer have any rights of representation, or at least it would be inconsistent for you to exercise your rights of representation after seceding, the U.S. government has no reason to treat you in the same way that it would treat the rights of states. At the same time, it's another reason why it's important to make a distinction between secession and insurrection from the position of the person seceding, is because in theory, anybody can declare a secession. Okay? It wouldn't be legal, but anybody in theory could declare a secession. Not as a legal, not in a legal sense, but in an actual sense of declaring it. I could say right now that I secede, but and that therefore the laws of the United States do not apply to me. But if I were to say that, then that would make me criminal. So, because I would be essentially be in the territory of the U.S. while also having seceded. So If you secede, then from the perspective of the United States, and this is why I'm saying this, because the perspective of the U.S. courts is that the secession was never valid and that therefore it was an insurrection. If you secede, okay, then even though your secession might be a fact due to perhaps your control of territory and your ability to exercise power in that territory, it might be a fact on the ground. You now are controlling territory that is claimed by the United States for a state in the United States, and by seceding, you no longer are representing yourself in the United States as the government of that state, which means that the United States does not consider your government a legitimate government of the state that you claim to be as seceding, but the United States denies the secession. And since you are not the legitimate government according to the United States, then the United States has no reason to believe that your secession was that of a secession coming from an actual state that was a member of the United States instead of a coup of some sort or a conspiracy of insurrection. So that's a very roundabout way of saying, but because the U.S. government has particularly Congress, has the power to suppress insurrections, it is extremely necessary for anyone that plans on seceding to be able to make it clear to the U.S. Congress, not to yourself, not to the government of your state, to make it clear to the U.S. Congress that the secession is not an insurrection. Okay. So I continue to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia and the governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Now, this also means because Congress has the right to call forth the militia, if a militia from a state that is seceding fights on the side of the state that is seceding, that militia itself is violating its duty to Congress in regards to the duty as is defined by the Constitution, assuming that the secession is not a legitimate secession. And again, who gets to decide that it is a legitimate secession? It doesn't matter whether the state decides that its own secession is legitimate. It must be legitimate in the eyes of both parties in order to function. Although in theory, the U.S. could, in theory, let's say hypothetically, decide to simply abandon the Hawaiian Islands. It would be a very terrible thing. But, well, for the Hawaiians anyway. Maybe. I don't know. They might do well on their own. Who knows? But let's say the U.S. decided to just simply abandon the Hawaiian Islands, and the Hawaiian Islands said, please don't leave. Then you might say that that would be unilateral, but unilateral on the side of the United States. Also, it would be a bit of a violation of the obligation that the federal government has to the several states, and therefore you could make a legal case based on that. Just like you could make a legal case that a state that secedes unilaterally is in violation to its duties to Congress. Okay, to exercise executive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceed. Okay, that's Washington, D.C. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So again, the United States government, the US Congress, according to this, has the right to suppress insurrections and also to, in theory, define for itself, for its own purposes, how exactly to suppress insurrections. And that, of course, means it's important for US Congress to be able to distinguish between legitimate secession and illegitimate insurrection. Because, as I said earlier, anybody in theory could choose to secede simply to escape justice or to try to form your own country in the territory of the United States. Anybody in theory could do that, could make that proclamation. But what's important is how will the US government react to it. So that was Article 1, Section 8. But I'm going to be going a bit further down here to Section 10. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attender ex post facto law or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. Now, it's important to mention a couple of things here. First of all, states can't enter into treaties on their own. They have to do it as part of the United States. So this is a negation of actions that states can take, entering into treaties, alliances, confederations, coining money, and various other things. And this negation is very important because it means that the normalization of a relationship between the United States and a seceding state necessarily requires the action of the United States, because the seceding state can't on its own, according to US law, decide to make a treaty with other countries asking for the legitimacy of its secession, or make treaties establishing its own territories as distinct from the territories of the United States of America. Because, of course, the secession is something that, as I said again, requires the US Congress to validate it, and to validate it by distinguishing it from an insurrection, and also by releasing the state from its obligations to, for example, the obligations of contracts. And what kinds of contracts could these be? Well, one type of contract is the treaties that the United States has. The USA has treaties with other countries defining its territories, defining its borders, defining its sovereignty over certain territory. And if a state takes an action that subverts these treaties that the US government has made, then that state itself is acting in opposition to its obligations as a state to the several states of the United States. So in that sense, this obligation of contracts is very important because it means that any act of secession is naturally in opposition to the United States treaties establishing its sovereignty over the territory of the states. And because of that, it means that once again, it is the US government, the federal government, Congress, that has to be involved in the secession process. Because if it is not, then in the very act of secession, the state seceding violates its obligation, okay, to fulfill contracts. That is to say, it violates the obligation of the US government to fulfill its contracts. Now, that might be a stretch to some people, but I think that that is a legitimate point to make here. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports except what may be absolutely necessary for executing its inspection laws. And the net produce of all duties and imports laid by any state on imports or exports shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States, and all such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of the Congress. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops. Again, keep troops without the consent of Congress, keep ships of war in times of peace without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. So, once again, the states require the permission of Congress to engage in agreements and compacts with other states and with foreign powers. Now, by seceding, a state alienates itself with the other states, while at the same time, therefore, either coming into an agreement for that alienation or alienating itself without an agreement, in which case the US government can choose whether or not it will acknowledge the sovereignty of such a state. So I will go now to Article 4. Full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state, and the Congress may, by general laws, prescribe the manner in which such acts, records, and proceedings shall be proved and the effect thereof. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Once again, the U.S. citizenship is a common citizenship that, while it consists in theory of citizenships between the various states, there is a uniform rule of naturalization established by Congress, which means that anybody that is alienating himself from the United States, let's say as part of a secession, while not alienating himself from a state that was part of the United States and alienating himself from the United States as a whole, therefore alienates himself from the uniform rule of naturalization, which means that he alienates himself into a disuniform rule of naturalization. That is to say, the naturalization of the rest of the states that remain and the state that leaves being disconnected. Which means that anybody leaving the United States not only while he may remain the citizen of a particular state he is in, he must leave the general citizenship of the United States. And this leaving must be construed to Congress in a way that does not construe it as treason or as desertion or as some other type of felony. In other words, in theory, in order to alienate yourself from the United States, you need to alienate yourself in such a way as does not make it a criminal alienation. And because the US controls the laws of its naturalization, it is up to the US to decide how that process works. Now, let me be very clear. In most cases, this is something that's very simple. It's as simple as acquiring another citizenship from another country. But in the case of secession, it's a bit different because you're not really acquiring a new citizenship that you didn't have before, because you're already a citizen of the state in the United States. So in that sense, it is somewhat different. And therefore, whether your alienation is legitimate also depends on whether the alienation of the state is legitimate. Okay. A person charged in any state with treason, felony, or other crime, who shall flee from justice and be found in another state, shall on demand of the executive authority of the state from which he fled be delivered up to be removed to the state having jurisdiction of the crime. And this establishes an extradition rule among the states. Now, the problem here is that if you leave the United States, this is something that should be legally resolved. In other words, you need to come to an agreement on the extradition of people that may have fled to your state that is now seceding, or may have fled from your state that is now seceding. And this of course, can be a very contentious issue, as it was in Hong Kong. The idea of extraditing between the different Chinese countries led to widespread protests, although I don't think that the protests were very legitimate in my opinion, but that's another topic. Okay, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof escaping into another shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. So in other words, the states have an obligation to each other for this extradition, and therefore any secession needs to sever this obligation while also resolving its opened claims. In other words, there shouldn't be a situation where suddenly a bunch of people flee to the state that's seceding in order to run away from the law. And from the perspective of the US government, that's obviously a situation that they would want to avoid, and therefore that can be a legitimate point of contention with a seceding state, as it has been with other countries in various situations where similar events have transpired. New states may be admitted, so that's a new state. But here's another point, and I think this point is important. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. In other words, the territorial integrity, that is to say, the U.S. government's sovereignty over its particular territory, and nothing in this Constitution shall be construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. And what does this mean? This means that the U.S. Congress has the full authority to define its own sovereign territory. Okay? And anything that a state does in violation of the sovereignty of the United States can therefore be opposed by the U.S. Congress. In other words, if a state were to secede, and again, this goes back to my point that I made about honoring the obligations. If a state were to secede, it would be in conflict with the United States' established sovereignty over that particular territory of the state. And you might say, well, aren't you construing that it prejudices then the territory of the particular state? The answer is no, because the particular states exist as states within the United States. Therefore, for a state to exist as a state outside of the United States requires the approval of Congress, of the Congress of the United States of America. Because Congress has the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. And nothing in the Constitution shall be construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. And if you disagree with all my other points up until now, this is the one, okay, that essentially means that unilateral secession in the United States, that is, the secession of any state in the United States as distinct from the authority of Congress, is illegal. Why? Because it violates, okay, it prejudices the claims of the United States respecting the territory and property belonging to the United States. Because it prejudices those claims, it is illegitimate. And therefore, okay, therefore, the United States has the complete right to take any action as allowed in the Constitution, including military action if it is defined as an insurrection, in which case it would be, to ensure that the sovereign territory of the United States is respected. So there you have it. That's my argument on why in the Constitution of the United States, unilateral secession is illegal, and therefore secession can only occur with the consent of Congress. If you disagree, please tell me in the comments section below. If you have a different perspective, a different legal perspective, a different interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, then I would also love to hear that. But until then, thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on Awultus over and out.